Next up is an offer of a few books that I've loved, and that's why I invited Carmine Gallo. And he's going to share with us 7 principles of innovation based on that book, one of those books, which is The Innovation Secrets of Steve Jobs. Carmine?
Thank you, Loic.
Welcome, Carmine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bonjour. Buongiorno. How many Italians do we have today? Possiamo parlare italiano adesso? Or should we stick to English? We'll stay to English. Good morning. In 2009, I wrote The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, which became an international bestseller here in France, Italy, Germany, the US, and I was very flattered that it has completely changed the way people around the world, executives and leaders, present themselves and pitch their ideas. But it was clear that we needed something more, a leadership book, something that would help us apply the principles that Steve Jobs carried with him throughout his entire life. The principles that made him successful, and how can we apply them to our own endeavors and startups and brands. And it is an inspiring story. I'm always inspired by thinking about those 2 high school friends who started in the spare bedroom of Steve's parents' house before getting too big and moving to the garage where the legend was born. Fortune magazine, one of our business publications in the US, named Steve Jobs the CEO of the decade. And at that time, a columnist for the New York Times named Thomas Friedman said, what the world needs is more Jobs, Steve Jobs. And what he meant to say was that entrepreneurship needs to be nurtured and embraced if we are to move forward in this global economy. And so he said, it's fair to ask ourselves, what would Steve do? But he didn't have an answer for it. So what would Steve do? What advice would he give the entrepreneurs in this room today? Principle number 1, without question, is to do what you love. I'm not making this up. This is what Steve told us is the secret to success. You just heard it from Bill Gross in a very poignant quote. Steve Jobs once said, being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed at night saying, we've done something wonderful. That's what matters. Passion is everything. I'm a communications coach, so I work with major executives around the world, people who lead companies that touch your lives every single day. And I always tell them, you cannot inspire unless you are inspired yourself. You cannot, as entrepreneurs, create anything new and exciting and innovative unless you are passionately excited about moving the world forward. In 1997, when Steve Jobs returned to Apple, you know the history, after that 12-year absence, he held an informal staff meeting. Listen to the role passion would play in revitalizing the brand.
This is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world. And we're not going to get a chance to get people to remember much about us. No company is. And so we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us. Our customers want to know who is Apple and what is it that we stand for. Where do we fit in this world? And what we're about isn't making boxes for people to get their jobs done, although we do that well. We do that better than almost anybody in some cases. But Apple's about something more than that. Apple, at the core, its core value, is that we believe that people with passion can change the world for the better. That's what we believe.
I love seeing those old clips. People with passion can change the world for the better. As an entrepreneur, you need to ask yourself, what is it that I'm passionate about? And it's not the obvious. Steve Jobs was not passionate about computers. He was passionate about creating tools that would help us unleash our personal creativity. That's what he was passionate about. So think about it before your next pitch or presentation. What is it that you're truly selling? What business are you really in? Steve Jobs would also urge us to put a dent in the universe, wouldn't he? This speaks to vision. Vision is very important. Vision is different than a mission statement. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., I think it's workshop room 4, I'll be giving a communications workshop for any entrepreneurs who are pitching themselves or their products. Please join me. We will talk about the difference between vision and mission. I don't care about your mission statement. A vision is different. A vision is clear, and it's concise, and it's consistently communicated. And it's very important. Steve Jobs once said, we're gambling on our vision, and we'd rather do that than make Me Too products. Vision inspires evangelists. Steve Wozniak was inspired by Jobs' vision to put a computer in the hands of everyday people. That was in 1976. So as you know, back then, the computer industry was relegated to hobbyists. So that was a bold vision, to put a computer in the hands of everyday people. Oh, and by the way, if Twitter had existed back then, Steve Jobs would have been able to tweet his vision, to put a computer in the hands of everyday people. The greatest visions in the world are bold, simple, and concise. A vision helps you see things that other people may have missed. Most of you remember that great story of Steve Jobs going to the Xerox facility in Palo Alto and seeing a crude graphical user interface being used for the first time. Well, Steve said that Xerox could have dominated the entire computer industry, but did not, because its vision, and he did use the word vision, was limited to making another copy machine. When I talked to some scientists about this, people who study how the brain operates, they said, Carmine, two people can see exactly the same thing and interpret it differently based on their vision. Isn't that interesting? Passion and vision go hand in hand. I learned a lot about vision from this man, Starbucks founder Howard Schultz. I write for Forbes, and I've written a couple of books, so I've interviewed him several times. He greatly admired Steve Jobs, and he had a vision too. He's an inspiring communicator and an inspiring leader. But when you ask him, what are you passionate about, what's your vision, it has nothing to do with coffee. When Howard Schultz started Starbucks, his vision was not to make a better cup of coffee. That's boring. That's not going to inspire anybody. His vision was to create this third place between work and home. Listen to the way he communicates the vision behind Starbucks in this CNBC interview.
Starbucks, in a sense, has become the quintessential experience brand, and the experience comes to life by our people. We've been able to, I think, create a system of attracting and retaining great people, building a training system that replicates what we do. And I think the only competitive advantage, and this is, an anathema compared to a tech company, is we have no patent. We have no secret sauce whatsoever. The only competitive advantage we have is the relationship we've built with our people and the relationship they have built with the customer. So when we go to...
You mentioned competitive advantage. You haven't mentioned the word coffee.
Not yet.
Your competitive advantage is not your coffee.
Well, I'll get to the...
But you just said your competitive advantage. I agree with you. It's the relationship with your people and the people with their people, with the customer.
And in fact, if you ask me what business we're in the people business. We're not in the coffee business. Mm-hmm. Of course we are as a product, but we're in the people business. 135,000 people, hiring 300 people a day, serving 40 million customers a week. It's all human connection. It's a sense of humanity and the sense of community that we've built in our stores. So at the end of the day, what we've been able to do is crack the code on being able to create an environment where people are treated well, they're respected, they're valued. Customers come in and they recognize this is a different kind of environment, almost an oasis.
Almost an oasis? Is he selling coffee? He's not selling coffee. You need to ask yourself, what's my vision? Howard Schultz is not selling coffee. Steve Jobs did not sell computers. He sold tools that would enrich your life. And that's the difference. What else would Steve do? Well, we got to think about creativity. How do you kickstart your brain? Well, Steve thought it was easy. Steve Jobs simply said creativity is connecting things. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. Harvard researchers spent 6 years studying great innovators. And guess what they found? They found that creative, innovative, successful leaders associate ideas from different fields and apply those ideas to their field. It's called association. They could have saved themselves 6 years of research just by asking Steve Jobs, because that's what he said is the secret to creativity. Why do you think Steve followed calligraphy when he was in college? Why do you think he went to India? Why do you think he studied appliances from consumer brands that had nothing to do with technology? Because creativity is connecting things. I recently wrote a book just about Foursquare called The Power of Foursquare. How many of you have checked in on Foursquare, by the way? Yeah, wow, huge number of you. That's great. It's a lot of fun. And it was a lot of fun talking to businesses and brands around the world that are reinventing themselves in the age of mobile social media. But something that Dennis Crowley said to me, you saw Dennis yesterday, he said something very interesting to me that reminded me about this principle. He said, Carmine, Foursquare is a more interesting tool because we built it in the East Village instead of Silicon Valley. Because it was not built by geeks for geeks. Now, I did not take that as a criticism. I live in Silicon Valley, and I'm confident that we're among the most creative places in the world. But I understand what he was saying, because he built Foursquare with input from people in real estate, finance, Broadway, music, arts. And he said because of that, it's a more interesting tool. What was he doing? He was connecting things. What ideas can we connect from outside fields? And as you create your products, please do us all a favor. Keep it simple. Say no instead of saying yes. Don't add clutter, remove clutter. Innovation, Steve Jobs says, comes from saying no to 1,000 things to make sure we don't get on the wrong track or try to do too much. So obviously we can apply this to the number of products that Apple manufactured, but also to the design. They eliminate the complexity. When you can create a product that a 2-year-old can use intuitively, you know you're onto something. Johnny Ive, who we now know was Steve Jobs' spiritual partner at Apple, said, we are absolutely consumed by trying to develop a solution that is very simple, because as physical beings, we understand clarity, simplicity. We crave, as human beings, we crave simplicity. And I think that's part of what Steve Jobs was trying to say when he said, eliminate, don't add. Even their website. How many of us have the courage to do what Apple does on their website? When they announce a new product or a new feature, they don't add it, they strip everything else away so that you can focus on what they want you to focus on. That's saying no instead of saying yes. Say no to 1,000 things. Simplicity is crucial. When Steve Jobs was asked for advice by the new CEO of Nike, Mark Parker, when he became the CEO, famous quote, and I love it. Steve Jobs said, get rid of the crappy stuff and focus on the good stuff. What else would Steve do? Let's think about this for a second. We've talked about passion, vision, creativity. How about the experience? It's not just about your product, it's about my experience with your product. The employees at Apple stores, for example, are told to enrich lives. It's all about innovating around the experience. Don't forget that. Innovation isn't just about product innovation, it's about the experience that I'm having with your product. When Steve Jobs started the Apple Store with Ron Johnson, he said people don't want to just buy personal computers, they want to know what they can do with them. And we're going to show them exactly that. So he innovated around the experience. Does anybody know what brand inspired the Apple Store? Anyone? What brand? No, close, Gap, but the hotel brand. The Four Seasons. Ron Johnson, Steve Jobs, and the team sat around and they asked themselves, where's the best customer experience you've ever experienced, that you've ever had? And they said the Four Seasons Hotel. Oh, going back to the other principle, ideas are connecting things. So it was actually inspired by a store or a organization, a hotel, completely outside of the computer field. That's why this is the Four Seasons. But see, this is why when you walk into an Apple store, you will not find a cashier. You'll find a concierge. That's why Ron Johnson decided to put a bar in the back of an Apple store, just like the one at the Four Seasons. They don't give away alcohol, but they dispense advice. Creativity is connecting things, but also innovate around the customer experience. Once you have your product, your service, you've got to get the pitch down. You have to master the message. Now, I'm a communications coach, so I work with executives to help them present their product and their vision more persuasively. Nobody was better than Steve Jobs. He informed, he illuminated, he inspired. We're going to miss him greatly. Nobody gives a presentation like Steve Jobs did. Why is this important, though? Because a person can have the greatest idea in the world, but if that person cannot convince enough other people, it doesn't matter. It always mattered to Steve Jobs. He didn't want his audience looking like this. A neuroscientist who works for the University of Washington, he studies brain processing. He said, Carmine, the brain does not pay attention to boring things. A Steve Jobs presentation was anything but boring. It informed, it illuminated, it inspired, all in one presentation. Now, how did he do that? Tomorrow in my communications workshop, we're going to go through a number of techniques. I want to tell you 2 techniques today that you can use immediately. Steve Jobs used these in every presentation. Number 1, the rule of 3. The rule of 3 is a very powerful communications technique that Jobs used brilliantly. The human mind can only process about 3 or 4 points of information in short-term memory. Well, if that's the case, don't bombard me with 22 benefits of your new product. I don't care. I only want 3. Steve Jobs did this all the time. When he introduced the iPad 2, what's the iPad 2? It's thinner, lighter, and faster than the original. If that's all you know, it tells you a lot. Thinner, lighter, faster. This philosophy, this approach, also applies to design. You've only got 3 models of iPads to choose from. Okay, design and communications. You will find groups of 3 in everything that Apple does. And every once in a while, Steve Jobs liked to have a little fun with it. In 2007, when he introduced the iPhone, people expected him to actually introduce 3 products. He had some fun with the audience. Here's what happened.
3 things: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
Nobody gives a presentation like Steve Jobs did. Here's the other technique that he employed brilliantly: thinking visually. Okay. I created this PowerPoint slide as an example of what most people do. And I don't care if you're using PowerPoint or Apple Keynote, same principles apply. This is what most people do. Let's fill up the entire slide. Bullets, sub-bullets, clip art, a chart. God forbid we have any white space anywhere on the slide. Let's fill it all up. When I first created this slide, I was really proud of myself because I said this is the world's ugliest slide. Would you agree it's pretty ugly? At least I thought so, until I saw this. This is officially the world's ugliest slide. That is a real PowerPoint that was created and distributed among the U.S. military. So no jokes, please. A general actually saw this and said, when I figure that out, we'll have won the war. The average PowerPoint has 40 words, the average slide. It was hard to find 40 words in 10 slides of a Steve Jobs presentation. How do you explain that? This is called picture superiority. Simply put, picture superiority means when you deliver information verbally, people remember about 10% of that information. Add a picture or an image, retention goes up to 65%. So think about it. Let's create a slide about the MacBook Air. Beautiful new MacBook Air. Let's create a slide about it. This is what most people would do. This is what I consider a typical slide. What are we doing? We put everything on the slide because we don't want any empty space. You know, we're not in the business of saying no to 1,000 things. We want to say yes to everything on the slide. And we don't even care about the font style is a little different. The typeface is different. Let's throw on some clip art. Let's just put everything on one slide. I think you would agree with me, this is a typical slide. What did Steve Jobs do differently? That's visual. What's more interesting to you? What's more memorable to you? What's more interesting and inspiring to you? This, by the way, takes work. This takes work. It takes weeks of drafting and sketching and creating ideas. But it was that important to Steve Jobs. Master the message and master the delivery and master the presentation. And finally, this is really important. This is probably the most important thing we can talk about. And since there's a couch here, I think I'm going to use the whole stage. I like this. Sell dreams, not products. As your customer, I don't give a rip about your product or your brand. I do care about myself, right? As human beings, we're self-consumed. I care about myself, my hopes, my dreams, my ambitions. Help me accomplish my dreams, and you'll win me over. Steve Jobs, in 1997, when he returned, said the cure for Apple is not cost-cutting. The cure is to innovate its way out of its current predicament. And how did he do that? He did that by focusing on his customers and their needs. This is a clip from one of the most brilliant presentations I've ever seen. And Steve Jobs did not introduce a product. He introduced a philosophy.
I want to just talk a little about Apple and the brand and what it means, I think, to a lot of us. You know, I think you always had to be a little different to buy an Apple computer. When we shipped the Apple II, you had to think different about computers. When computers were these things you saw in movies, they occupied giant rooms. They weren't these things you had on your desktop. You had to think differently because there wasn't any software at the beginning. You had to think differently when a first computer arrived at a school where there had never been one before, and it was an Apple II. I think you had to think really differently when you bought a Mac. It was a totally different computer, worked in a totally different way, used a totally different part of your brain. And it opened up a computer world for a lot of people who thought differently. You were buying a computer with an installed base of 1. You had to think differently to do that. And I think you still have to think differently to buy an Apple computer. And I think the people that do buy them do think differently. And they are the creative spirits in this world. They are the people that are not just out to get a job done, they're out to change the world. And they're out to change the world using whatever great tools they can get. And we make tools for those kinds of people. So hopefully, what you've seen here today are some beginning steps that give you some confidence that we too are going to think differently. and serve the people that have been buying our products since the beginning. Because a lot of times people think they're crazy, but in that craziness we see genius, and those are the people we're making tools for. Thank you very much.
That is why we miss Steve Jobs. A Disney executive a couple of years ago who had the role of revitalizing the Disney stores called Steve and asked him for advice. And Steve just had 2 words. He said, dream bigger. Dream bigger. And I think that's the advice he would leave for all of us today, and I think that's the best way for us to honor and cherish his legacy, is to leave this conference today dreaming bigger. See genius in your craziness. Believe in yourself, believe in your ideas, and sell those ideas with passion and confidence, because it's those ideas that will ultimately transform your destiny and potentially change the world. Thanks for your time today. Merci. Thank you.
That was incredible, Carmine. Thank you for bringing some of Steve Jobs' spirit with us at LeWeb, and I agree, we should think really big.